Alrighty, guys. So, as promised last week, I said that I would talk through some of the, maths related around fat loss because it can be pretty confusing. And I had a question from one or two clients that I thought this would probably help them get their mind around it. And it's actually pretty cool if I do say so myself. I also like GIFs. So, if you don't, you're in for a bad time. If you do, you're going to love it. I'm going to try and keep it relatively short, but try and pack quite a bit into it. So let's grab a pen and paper if you want to take a few notes or whatever you want to do. Just pay attention. Cool. So what I'm going to quickly talk about within this is how I set up a diet for fat loss, the confusion between weight loss and fat loss and why that's kind of important, why most people don't lose as much fat as predicted or what they would expect themselves to lose, and how to, give yourself the best chance to lose as much as predicted or how much you would expect to lose. So, getting started. How often have you or have you heard someone say, I'm eating in a calorie deficit, but I'm not losing fat? As Ron down the bottom is showing us, we've all probably felt that way before. Now, what we need to know is that basically, if you're not losing fat, then you are not in a calorie deficit. That is plain and simple. A calorie deficit essentially means that you have to be losing fat. There is no ifs, buts, maybes. If you're in a calorie deficit, you're losing fat. Now, as you can see on the next one, there is, however, a discrepancy because we can see fat loss without necessarily seeing weight loss in the short term. So what I mean by that is that you may not see changes on the scale, so your weight may not change, but if you are doing everything right, if you are creating a calorie deficit, then we're going to be seeing fat loss regardless of what the scale says. I should have pressed that at the start, but we don't want too much loop anyway. The fuck, Ron? Anyway, so this is what I'm just explaining here. So, like I was saying, we can see kind of fat loss occurring, but not literally occurring on the scale. And that happens because there are a number of things that can influence our scale weight that can kind of mask true fat loss. So as we can see on this graph here, this is just something that I did as an infographic on Instagram. We can see that muscle obviously being the thing that changes the slowest. So it's an incredibly slow process building muscle. And even losing muscle isn't super fast unless you go into space, as it turns out. But what we can see then after that is that fat is also relatively slow in terms of how much it changes day to day. So we're not looking at kind of kilograms of fat loss a day. Anyone that's talking about that is straight up bullshitting out of their ass. That's just never going to happen. If you think about like your total daily energy expenditure, let's say on average 2,500 as a total daily energy expenditure, so how many calories you're burning. Let's say you are starving in a desert and you're burning 2,500 calories a day. Even that, one, it's not all going to come from fat loss, but as you'll see later, in a kilogram of fat, there is roughly 7,700 calories. So that pretty much means that over the course of a week, you might lose a bit over a kilogram of pure fat. You're going to lose a lot of weight through water and stuff, but not fat. Anyway, off track. So as we can see, fat fairly slow. Glycogen can change quite a bit day to day. So glycogen is just the stored form of carbohydrate in your muscles. An interesting thing about glycogen is that for every gram of glycogen stored within your liver and your muscles, it binds with water, and I think it's about 3 to 4 grams of water that bind with it. So the easiest way, or what you would see with this, is that when people go on a ketogenic diet, they typically lose quite a large amount of weight within the first week or so, and often talk about how great it is. But the reality is that a lot of that initial drop in weight is actually water weight, because as glycogen levels in the muscles reduce due to not eating carbohydrates, the water is also lost alongside that. Then we can also see food/poop. So if you haven't gone to the toilet in a few days, you're probably going to be a little bit heavier. And if you're just eating more food, you have more food going through the digestive tract. That's also going to affect your scale weight. And then obviously water can fluctuate massively day to day. As if you ask any kind of woman, there's certain kind of times during their cycle where their body will hold onto water or retain water and things like that, which can change scale weight massively. So here's what we're going to kind of talk about in a little bit more detail. So I've called this Goldilocks and the three deficits, basically because I thought it was funny, but it also kind of works pretty well. So when we're talking about deficits, we can essentially look at it in kind of three different ways. So we have the calculated deficit, which is essentially when I create your nutrition plan, I'm coming up with this. So that's essentially what we're aiming for. That is what we're trying to do by dieting, is create this calorie deficit. We then have the perceived deficit. So this is what we think we're creating. And most of the time, our perceived and calculated deficit, so we think that we're hitting our calculated deficit, and that's what we assume. And then we have the actual deficit, and that's what we're actually creating. And so as you can see down the bottom here, sticking with that 2500 example, we can see that our total daily energy expenditure is at 2500. We've calculated the deficit at, looks like 2000. We think we're probably even eating maybe just a tiny bit less. That's pretty common. In reality, our actual deficit, we're actually eating more than we expected, which is closing that deficit gap and ultimately slowing the rate of fat loss. And this is pretty likely in a lot of cases. Cool, so getting into the maths. I'll try and keep it relatively short. I'm also following on with the Goldilocks effect, so if you didn't find it funny at first, hopefully this wins you over. So, starting on the left, we can see, I'm going to assume that these days Goldilocks is a 23-year-old active female who spends a lot of time fighting bears. I can imagine, as someone who's fighting bears after a traumatic childhood, that she's fairly muscular, she does a lot of exercise, that kind of thing. But recently she's gone on holiday because she's gotten over the bear fighting life. She's gained a little bit of weight, and now she wants to lose 5 kilograms in 12 weeks. So, based upon that, by my calculations, and again, this is completely made up, she would have a total daily energy expenditure of around 2,500 calories. Now, when I'm working out your total daily energy expenditure, I'm going to be taking into consideration your weight, your height, your activity levels, your lifestyle, what you've told me in the information form, basically about where you're at and what you've been doing and things like that, and come up with a more accurate estimate. But it's always going to be an estimate, so that's always important to remember. And it's never going to be static either. That's going to change day to day. Cool. On the right here, we have the maths. So we can see that she wants to lose 5 kilograms in 12 weeks. That works out to be 0.4 kilograms a week. Now, as I said before, we know a kilogram of fat has 7,700 calories roughly. The reason I say roughly is that it's not an exact science, because what we're assuming with that is that our fat cells just contain fat, whereas in reality there's a few other things in there, water, stuff like that. So yeah, but it's a close enough starting point that it's useful, and that's what everyone uses. So 7,700 calories roughly a week, in a kilogram of fat, sorry. So if we then times that by the 0.4 kilograms a week loss we're looking for, that would require a 3,080 weekly calorie deficit. Now that's really important to remember, because if you were to do some kind of calorie or carb cycling type diet, or you wanted to create your diet in a way that you had 2 high days and 5 low days, things like that, then weekly deficit is always kind of handy to do, because you would just be creating a larger deficit on some days and a smaller or no deficit on other days. And I've done that with a lot of clients. Because if it suits your lifestyle, it improves adherence, and we know that's where the secret sauce is. So that next one down, we can see then if we divide the 3,080 calories of the weekly deficit by 7, so looking at a daily deficit, we get roughly 440 calories. So that would basically mean that if Goldilocks was to create a 440 calorie deficit each day for 12 weeks, she'll achieve her goal. Now, we've got the dot 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 there because it's not quite so simple. So the problems with this is that that would be a perfect situation if we were machines. Basically meaning that if we could control and we were expending the same amount of energy and taking in exactly the same amount of intake every single day, we would definitely see that. Unfortunately, we are not machines and there is a number of problems. So as you can see here, the first one is that measuring calorie intake is imperfect. And I will come back to this, but just to quickly give a bit of an overview, basically, yes, we can measure how many calories are coming in by tracking, weighing, that kind of thing. But there's a lot of things that go on with inside the body, like even if we are doing that really well and accurately, that can dictate kind of what happens. So like how much is absorbed, how much is used, how efficient our body uses it, things like that, which can change basically the amount of calories we actually intake from a given amount of food, how much protein you eat, the fiber, processed and whole foods, they're all going to affect that intake. The second one is that humans in general, we're all pretty shit at estimating our intake, or even, at estimating our intake. So there are a ton of studies looking at this, and basically what we know is that people are terrible at estimating their intake. And that's not just like certain people. We've seen males, females, overweight, lean. Even there's a study or two on dietitians and things like that. And the majority of people are pretty terrible at it. I should have put a slide in here, but there's a pretty famous study that basically showed that some people underestimate their intake by 50% and overestimate their energy expenditure. And that's super, super common. Basically, does not help when it comes to fat loss. And then third, down the bottom there, we can see that our bodies kind of resist weight loss through metabolic and behavioral adaptations. So that's what I'm just going to quickly talk about next. So this is something that I put in an article that you may have seen, but when we're talking about metabolic adaptation, these are the adaptations that goes on within our body when we're in a calorie deficit to essentially resist further fat loss, because our body sees fat loss as a threat in the long term, and it doesn't want us to keep losing weight. Because basically our ancestors grew up in a time when starving to death was a lot more realistic than becoming overweight and obese. So our body over the years evolved to develop mechanisms to stop that happening. And because our ancestors, like I said, were not obese or overweight, and having a lot of food was not something that was super common, our bodies don't tend to have the same defense mechanisms going the other way, so stopping us from becoming overweight. What we can see here is that basically our body reduces the amount of energy that we expend day to day. And we can see what's driving that is a reduced metabolic or resting metabolic rate. And basically, like a smaller body. So as you lose weight, you're going to be weighing less. That burns less calories. And there is kind of a slight reduction in just metabolic rate as well. Nothing to write home about though. We also see reduced exercise activity thermogenesis, so you're burning less calories when you're exercising and doing things like that. Again, because you're a smaller body, you've got less weight, but also because our body becomes more efficient at utilizing energy and doing certain movements. We see a drop in non-exercise activity thermogenesis, so our body naturally, subconsciously makes us a little bit lazier. We sit on the couch a little bit longer, we don't fidget as much, we don't get up and down from the couch, all those kind of things reduce our NEAT levels. And then we also know that we're we're eating a little bit less food than what we were before, and because the amount of calorie intake does have an effect on the thermic effect of food, then that typically drops as well. But if you're going from a lower protein diet to a higher protein diet, I would actually say that a lot of that it would probably work out even. You wouldn't see a large drop in that. But basically, our body becomes more efficient and lazy, which is why staying active, tracking your steps, doing things is so important, because that NEAT level and the EAT level can kind of battle against those adaptions a lot more than other aspects. So this is a really, really interesting kind of, I pulled this from a study, but basically this kind of shows what happens and why fat loss may not be, and why that kind of actual deficit is not the same as the calculated deficit, or why we don't lose as much fat as we would expect. So what we can see straight from the get-go here, that dark line, that's energy intake. So in this, they basically had people, as you can see, dieting for 2 years by the looks of it. And we can see that they dropped energy intake quite drastically at the start. And we can see that basically over kind of that first 12 months, we can see energy intake actually crept back up towards baseline. And we can see energy expenditure also dropped initially, and appetite rose as well pretty quickly. And that's essentially just the body's way of trying to fight against an energy deficit. So appetite increases, energy expenditure decreases, and our energy intake slowly creeps back up to where it initially was. Pretty cool, really, but also sucks if you're trying to lose body fat. So what can we actually do about this? Well, the goal is to get our actual deficit as close to our calculated deficit. So I calculate the deficit, I give you your nutrition plan, and the goal is that we try and get as close to that as possible, because when we do that, that's when we see the fat loss rate that we kind of calculated and expected. Now, I know not all of you have like a set number for a set number of weeks, and that's absolutely fine. In that case, when I'm working it out, what I would do is basically I work off looking for a loss of 0.5 to 1% per week of body weight, sorry. And you, as many of you will know, that doesn't mean that if I don't see that week, that I then automatically cut calories. And the reason I do this is because I know that realistically, it's unlikely that your body has adapted in a 1 week time frame. That just doesn't happen. So it's likely to be something else that is slowing down the change in the scale weight, whether that is compliance and we're not quite creating the deficit that we thought, or whether that is the fact that you're holding water, that you've been stressed, that sleep's been crap, or something like that, and that's causing your scale weight not to move. So yeah, just explaining that. It's also why we measure and weigh our foods, at least initially, and that's to create an awareness of calories. Now, like I said, it's not a perfect science, but the reason that I suggest people do it initially is it's because it's the most accurate thing we have at the moment. I mean, they have obviously like scientific methods that can be super accurate, but unless you have thousands of dollars, it's not going to be applicable to you. So it's about the best thing that we have in terms of accuracy and getting us close enough to see the resultant fat loss. We also know females, you're going to have a little bit less wriggle room, and that's just generally because you have a smaller total deficit most of the time. And the reason for that is when I'm working it out, let's say if you're not super active, a female who may have like a smaller total daily energy expenditure, I don't want to starve you, I don't want to drop your calories super, super low, so we have a little bit less of a deficit to create. Now, that doesn't mean that you're going to see less total fat loss. It may just mean that it may take a slightly longer period, and there may be more weeks where we see slower or lower, what am I trying to say? A smaller drop on the scale, things like that. It also means that if you want to see the best results in the shortest amount of time, it's pretty much down to your diligence and how accurately you follow the plan. Because at the end of the day, we have the calculated deficit, So if you're consistently hitting your calorie target, tracking accurately, you're keeping your movement up, then we're going to see those changes that we would expect. But the other thing that's obviously can disrupt that is that we need to manage the factors that can then affect those three big things. So things like sleep, which is going to affect your energy intake and your movement for the day. Stress is also likely to make you want to eat more food, or affect kind of exercise levels and that kind of thing. And the same with emotions. So trying to manage factors that are going to affect those big three things. And just to finish on, I just want you to remember that if you don't have a short-term date that you're kind of working towards, then there's really no rush. So if you're not doing a photo shoot, if you're not doing a comp, if you don't have a wedding, whatever those short-term dates are, then do not rush things, because at the end of the day, rushing things, like there's no point rushing things if it means 12 to 18 months later you're back to where you started. It's going to be better if you take the time to create the skills, build the habits, all that kind of thing for long-term development. And as we can say there, yes, we want to progress at a reasonable rate, but trying to be perfect and trying to make sure that you're as good as possible requires more restraint and less flexibility. So basically meaning it'll be more taxing on you, both mentally and physically. You won't be able to go out and eat as much, because when we eat out, we know that we can't track as accurately, so we have less flexibility, and that's negatively going to affect long-term sustainability. And that's essentially why, unless you are doing a photo shoot or doing a comp, I am not going to be like screaming down the monitor at you, that you have to be perfect, or that you have to do this and that kind of thing, because I know that basically sustainability and being good enough is going to get us towards our goals in the long term, rather than intermittent bursts of perfection. Anyway, that is it. So, thanks for watching. If you made it all the way through, hopefully I didn't talk too long and I didn't bore you. Hopefully you learn a lot. If you have any questions, you know where to reach me. And I'm out.